Hey, what's up? Welcome back to the channel. My name's Josh, and today we're chatting a little bit more about the Canon R3. Now, I've made a lot of videos on this channel about the Canon R3, but what we're going to do today is a little bit different. A few months ago, I made a video all about 5 amazing features that the R3 has that you for sure want to start utilizing in your workflow with this camera. This video is kind of a part 2 for that video, but really this is geared more towards just kind of random features that just give quality of life improvements on using this camera. A few small setting changes that are going to make using this camera just so much easier and so much more fun, and hopefully make the shooting process more enjoyable overall. All right, let's dive in. So the first feature I want to talk about is the silent shutter toggle switch that you can enable on this camera. Because this camera has a mechanical shutter as well as an electronic shutter, this camera has the capability of shooting completely silently using the electronic shutter. There's definitely some advantages of using the mechanical shutter, but every once in a while you might want to switch over to the electronic shutter to have completely silent shooting. And did you know you can actually customize the little photo video toggle switch to just turn on and off that silent shutter? So if you go into your menu and you go over to the custom functions menu and over to custom functions menu number 5, that top little menu item is what we're talking about. So this is the little photo video toggle switch on the top of the camera. And by default, this is set to switch between photo and video modes. Now, if you're a hybrid shooter and you're shooting photos and videos consistently and you're switching back and forth, you'll probably want to leave this as set. But if you're just shooting stills, if you go into this menu and switch this function to the silent shutter function switching, then when you switch the toggle over from the photo mode into the video mode, it switches over to the silent electronic shutter, so you can go from mechanical shooting, one switch over to electronic shutter shooting just by toggling that switch. This can be incredibly useful for photographers in certain situations where you want to be using the mechanical shutter, but every once in a while you need to step into a situation where you need to be completely incognito. This is a great way to make that happen. Now, alternatively, you can also program this to the actual little record button instead of the toggle itself. So if we go back into the menu, turn the silent shutter function switching back to photo and video recording, go back into the custom functions menu and over to submenu 4 and go down to customize buttons. Then on the photo side of things, if we scroll down to the movie button, we can actually switch this. I have this currently set to switch between the viewfinder and the screen, but you can set this to also toggle the silent shutter. This gives you the capability of still utilizing that toggle switch to toggle between photo and video, but then when you are in photo mode, you can press the record button and that enables the silent shutter. So it's really up to you how you decide to use this. If you're more of a photo shooter, you might want to just enable that toggle switch. If you're shooting photo and video, you might want to just program the record button to make that switch. Whichever one works for you, that's great, but this is an incredibly useful feature that you definitely should know about. The second incredibly useful feature this camera has is specifically for people who are operating this camera with multiple lenses that have different maximum apertures. So say for instance, you're shooting on this lens here, which is the 35mm 1.4, you're using that lens at like 1.8 or f2, and then you swap over to a 24-70 that has a maximum aperture of f2.8. Normally what happens when you do that is you lose a lot of your exposure in the camera, you have to redial in all of your settings, but the camera can actually do this for you automatically. So if you go back into the menu, go over to the custom functions menu and submenu number 2, the very top item in that menu is same expo for new aperture. And by default, this is disabled, but you can turn this on to ISO speed and shutter speed, or just shutter speed. Basically what this is doing is the camera will automatically compensate for the change in aperture by changing some of these settings. Now, personally, I don't like it to change the shutter speed because I've already dialed in my shutter speed and I have that set how I want it. I don't want it to change the ISO and the shutter speed, but to change the ISO by a couple of stops to compensate for my loss in aperture is completely okay with me. So now that I have that setting set to ISO, the camera will automatically compensate for a loss in aperture on the lens using the ISO. So for instance, say I'm shooting on this lens right here, my shutter speed is set to 1/250th of a second, my aperture is set to f2.0, and my ISO is set to 1600. Obviously, that's not the maximum aperture this lens has, but say for this example, that's how I have my settings set up. Then I take this lens off and I pop on a 24-70 f2.8. From f2.0, which is how I had this lens set, to f2.8, which is the maximum aperture of the 24-70 f2.8 lens, that's a one-stop loss in exposure because of the new lens. So now, because I have that setting set to compensate using the ISO, my ISO is just going to change from ISO 1600 to ISO 3200 automatically, giving me exactly the same exposure with the new lens, even though I've lost an exposure stop with the aperture. This is just an incredible quality of life improvement if you're swapping lenses around a lot, just so you can trust that when you pop on a new lens, the camera's automatically going to compensate for you so that you don't have to redial in your exposure for every single new lens. The third relatively unknown useful feature that the R3 has that you absolutely should know about is this camera's capability to shoot at 195 frames per second raw images in its maximum burst speed. Now, if you just look at the spec sheets are going to say this camera can shoot at 12 frames per second when you're using the mechanical shutter and 30 frames per second when you're using the electronic shutter, which is true. But this camera actually has a custom burst mode where you can drastically increase the amount of frames per second this camera is shooting. Now, this will only apply to cameras that have firmware installed of 1.2.0 or later, so just make sure you're on the latest firmware and you should be good to go. And here's how you access this. So go into the shooting menu and go over to submenu number 7, and right at the top, you're gonna have your drive mode. This is where you have your single shooting, your high-speed continuous plus, high-speed continuous, low-speed continuous, and this one over here that says custom high-speed continuous. Now, if you press the info button, you can see that you can customize the shooting speed and the number of shots up to 50 shots. So you can dial the shooting speed in from 30 frames per second up. So basically you're going from the high-speed continuous plus, which is 30 frames per second on the electronic shutter, and you're ramping this up 40 frames per second, 50 a second, 60 a second, all the way up to 195 frames per second. Then you can also customize the number of images that happen in this burst up to 50 images. Once you've done that, it'll show you at the bottom how long that shooting time is going to take, which in this case at 195 shots for 50 photos is 0.26 seconds. So it's going to take 195 photos in a quarter of a second just by pressing the shutter button one time. This is incredibly useful for like wildlife photography or for sports. If you really have to capture that shot, it'll literally take 195 images in a quarter of a second. And not in JPEG, these are raw images. So it's gonna take a little bit of time to buffer, but this is incredibly, incredibly useful for those blink and you'll miss it moment. This is a fantastic tool and you definitely should be aware of it. The fourth setting that I wanna talk about is the ability to customize the parameters of the shutter speed within the camera. So on the R3, the longest shutter speed you can have on the mechanical shutter is a 30-second shutter, not counting for the bulb shutter where you just hold it open. And the shortest shutter speed, the quickest interval you can have is a 1/8,000th of a second on the mechanical shutter. And on the electronic shutter, I think it goes up to 1/64,000th or something, somewhere in there. But most of us in our practical shooting situations are not going to be using that entire range of shutter speeds in the course of one shoot. And so a huge quality of life improvement here is that you can actually customize the shutter speed range that you'll allow the camera to shoot at. So if you go back into the custom functions menu and go down to submenu 2, scroll almost all the way to the bottom and it says set shutter speed range. So if you click on that, you can choose between the mechanical shutter and the electronic shutter. And then you can click into those and you can customize the lowest or the longest time the shutter speed will be open, as well as the highest or the fastest time for that shutter. Customizing your lowest and your highest shutter speed can be incredibly useful in situations like sports, where you for sure don't want to drop your shutter speed below a certain time because you don't want to start introducing motion blur in your images. It's far too easy just to be clicking away, changing your settings, refixing your exposure, and all of a sudden realize, oh, my shutter speed is way lower than I want it to be. A lot of these photos have unintended motion blur in them, or I'm just shaking the camera unintentionally and introducing artificial motion blur just because my hands weren't steady or something like that. And so setting your lowest and your highest parameters to the specific range that you want to be shooting in means that you'll never exceed those parameters unless you go back into that menu and change those settings. The next function I want to talk about is very, very similar to that shutter speed parameter one, but this has to do with the aperture. Just like you can set the parameters for the maximum and minimum shutter speeds, you can do the same thing with your aperture. Back to the custom functions menu, submenu number 2, and scroll all the way to the bottom, you can set your maximum aperture and your minimum aperture. Now, personally, I don't have a lot of situations where I want to define parameters on my aperture. I'd much prefer to do that on my shutter speed, but if you're in certain situations where you want to make sure you stay within a certain aperture range, this can be incredibly useful for you. The sixth useful setting that I want to talk about on the R3 is the ability to limit the shot count when you're shooting in continuous burst mode. If you're anything like me, I oftentimes have my camera set to continuous high plus because I want to just be able to hold the shutter button down and have it take a burst of images, but it can definitely be too easy to accidentally hold the shutter button down for a little bit longer than you intended, and all of a sudden now you ended up with 150 raw images that you have to look through, edit through, call through, and are taking up space on your hard drive. That can get really annoying, and so if you have a specific specific number of images that you want to shoot before the camera stops shooting, you can define that number. If you go back into the custom functions menu over to submenu number 3, you can scroll down to the third menu item and it says limit continuous shot count. And by default, this is disabled, but if you start scrolling up, you can limit the shot count from anywhere between 2 images and 99 images. This can also be helpful if you're in situations like me, where you're shooting bursts of images that you're going to be using for video, but you only want to shoot a certain amount. Say for instance, you only want to shoot 72 images because you know that's going to turn into 6 seconds of stop motion animation once you import that into your editor. Now you can go into your camera, you can limit the continuous shot count to 72, then you can hold the shutter button down and know that it's going to shoot for 72 images and then stop. That helps you limit any superfluous images that might happen at the end and just stops you from being a little bit trigger happy with your shutter button. And the final useful feature on the R3 that I want to talk about is the ability to save all of these custom settings to a memory card. If you're anything like me and you go into all your menus and you customize everything, it can be a little bit nerve-wracking to worry about having to switch cameras and having to go through and change all those settings all over again. Or if you decide to rent an additional camera and you want that additional camera to work the same as your personal camera, you can actually export all of the custom settings that you've made on your camera to a memory card and then import those to a new camera. So to access this, go into the settings menu into submenu number 5, and then scroll down to save/load cam settings on card. If you click this, you have two options, save to card or load from card. And if you select save to card, it will save all of your internal camera settings to the memory card that you have in the camera. Then you can take that memory card out, file it away for safekeeping, or insert it into like a rental camera or someone else's camera that you want to have the same setup as yours. Go back into the settings menu and then select load from card, and then both cameras will be set up identically. So hopefully that's been a helpful look at some useful quality of life features that the R3 has. If the video's been helpful, feel free to give it a like or let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. It means the world to me, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.